Dear friends, welcome to the 18th Joint Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, that is ASHA, and Ganga Jamni lecture on our shared past and its historical sources. Today, we have a scholar who teaches at University of Exeter, UK, but has origins in the Indian subcontinent. His paternal family comes from Allahabad in UP and Husainabad in Bihar. While from his maternal side, he has origins in a Gujarati family settled in Zanzibar. He truly represents a cosmopolitan background. Dr. Sajjad Rizvi is an associate professor of Islamic intellectual history and the director of the Center for the Study of Islam at the University of Exeter. An intellectual historian who specializes in the history of philosophical traditions in the Mughal Safavid period, he has published 2 books on the well-known philosopher Mullah Sadra Shirazi, who died in 1636. His interests extend to the study of mysticism, Quranic exegesis, as well as the nexus of poetry and philosophy. He did his BA from history and MPhil in modern Middle East studies from Oxford. His PhD was, however, completed from the Pembroke College at Cambridge. He is currently completing 2 monographs, one on a diachronic study of discourses on time in Islamic thought, and the other on philosophy between Iran and North India in the long 18th century. I came in contact with Sajjad at the Shi'i Institute at London for the first time in 2016, where both he and I were the fellows and participants in a symposium which was held by the Institute. In his talk today, he will examine connected intellectual histories of Shi'i scholarly networks in the early modern Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. He is going to present 4 case studies, 2 from Deccan and 2 from North India, that exemplify the notion of Shi'i scholarly networks and connections between India and other parts of the Muslim world. Welcome, Dr. Sajjad Rizvi. Over to you, Sajjad.
Thank you, Professor Nadeem Rizvi, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this series. Thank you for that very generous introduction as well. Just to say that when you, of course, asked me to speak, I was kind of wondering what I could speak about, since I don't consider myself to be, in some ways, a conventional historian. I'm much more interested in history of philosophy in particular. But then I thought I could speak on something which connects with some of the work I've done in different periods in early modernity, and also that I could say something which links to a certain extent with my project on the 18th century. The project in the 18th century is very much about philosophy, not necessarily about theology, but there are some important overlaps. And I guess the third reason why I thought I would pick on something like this is because it falls within what I'm calling connected intellectual history. It's becoming very common, you could say, nowadays for people to focus on this particular theme, looking at how it is that we understand connections not just across South Asia, but also understand how those connections work with adjacent regions, and how, in a sense, by looking at connected intellectual histories, we can overcome some of the parochialism of nationalist historiographies, right? So nationalist historiographies, whether they are Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, but also Iranian, Afghan, and with all the other successor states that we have across the Middle East, South Asia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and so forth. So that was very much the thinking behind it. The original title I gave you, of course, was misleading, Transnationalism. I really don't think transnationalism works in a pre-modern period anyway. But that was also, in a sense, a useful hook to find people, because transnationalism is something which is used extensively nowadays in the study of Shi'i networks, the idea of the Shi'i international. So when people talk about contemporary Shi'i thought in the world, they talk about certain types of Shi'i internationals. They talk about the connections which came out of the Da'wah party in Iraq, which connected people into Lebanon, even into parts of South Asia, certainly into Iran, into the Gulf, into the Persian Gulf, but also the important internationalism which really began in the 70s, and especially with the Iranian Revolution, 1979, which brought back about quite a radical political theology in a Shi'i context, and how then that notion of Shi'i intellectual life, authority, political theology has then been disseminated around the world by the Iranian revolutionaries. So going into Pakistan quite extensively, going into India, of course, even extensively in parts of Kashmir, and far beyond. So that those two elements of Shi'i internationalism and transnationalism are things which I'm sure many people will be familiar with, and how it is that they link communities in South Asia with predominantly Persian, Arabic-speaking communities and other communities beyond South Asia. Okay, now, so that's, in a sense, setting a bit of the scene. Do we now have the PowerPoint so we can proceed? Yes. Okay, cool. So, so if we can begin with the first slide. As I said, this is very much an exercise in connected intellectual history. So what I'm broadly speaking not doing is looking at how it is that aspects of material culture connect Shi'i communities and Shi'i-inflected communities in South Asia with others. So I'm not talking about the material culture of commemorations of Karbala and Muharram, or Imam Bargah's, Hussainiyah's, Karbala's, these spaces of communal memory and commemoration. Nor am I necessarily looking at the patronage of monuments, of which there are very many. Of course, we know in the Deccan, in Hyderabad, but also in the north, we think of the various qadamgahs. There are plenty of qadamgahs dotted around South Asia, Panja Sharifs as well. I think one of the most unusual Panja Sharifs I ever came across was up in the mountains near Kohat in the frontier, what's known as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan now, where there was this kind of rock formation which looked like a handprint on the side of the mountain. And that's one example. Then, of course, we are familiar with the ones which are in Delhi itself. And of course, in Hyderabad, in Sindh, there is a famous Qadamgah there as well. And there's many others dotted throughout. Nor am I looking at connections through, wider aspects of what sometimes is called Persianate culture with respect to dress, with respect to food, with respect to comportment, and the wider notion of other But rather, I guess I will be really talking about individuals, and I will be talking about literary practices and texts. So that's just kind of to set the scene of what it is that I'm not doing. So moving on, the next slide. I just want to give some definitions about how we might think about these things before I tell you a bit more about the structure of what I will talk about. So by connected intellectual histories, these are sorts of things that I mean by connected intellectual histories. We're talking about polycentric and multilingual transmissions and production of knowledge. That's absolutely central. Transmission and production, quite simply because it's not always just about production. The internal claims are always about transmission, as we know. A lot of pre-modern intellectual cultures are based on the idea that they are merely glossing or merely transmitting or imitating work in the past. They're not always focused very much on saying that this is something which I've come across, which is new, but rather they're connecting and they're perpetuating what they consider to be a tradition. And that is true whether one's talking about intellectual rational pursuits or whether one's talking about more scriptural ones. So we're interested in networks, we're interested in discourses, not yet, I'm still on the previous slide, thank you. We're interested in networks, discourses, contexts and texts, which can connect these sorts of languages and centers between North India, West India, and the Deccan, across Indian Ocean systems, across to the Arab Peninsula, the importance of Yemen, but especially the Hijaz, the two cities of Mecca and Medina. And then, of course, one thinks of Central Asia, the important centers of places like Bukhara and Samarkand, Samarkand in particular, Iran, and beyond. And in fact, with respect to a lot of the intellectual traditions in South Asia, whether they're in Shi'i contexts or not, there are two places which stand out. A third, if we include the scriptural sciences, which are essential. One is Samarkand in Central Asia. The other one is Shiraz. So if one's interested in things like mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, philosophical theology, logic, and so forth, Samarkand and Shiraz are absolutely central. And if one's interested in things like hadith and the transmission of narratives of the Prophet, and importantly, what I mean is hadith not just in the Sunni tradition, but also in the Shi'i traditions, then Mecca and Medina become quite significant as well. And these are the three kind of centers which intersect with important places in North India and the Deccan, and also West India, by which I predominantly mean Gujarat. So it's important to link these places up. And I guess one of the reasons why we might also want to do it is not just to break out of the parochialism of nationalist historiographies within South Asia and within Iran, but also the way in which we tend to look at the world of Islam as being centered on the Arab lands, or on what sometimes are called the central Islamic lands, which, basically Egypt to Iraq, right? And actually to suggest that in terms of what is happening intellectually, especially in this period from, say, 1400 or so to 1800, it is not that area between Egypt and Iraq, which is dominant, but actually a slightly different area, one which I guess you might describe as, in the late Shah Ahmed's book, he talks about the Bengal to Balkans complex. But generally the idea of the space between the area between Istanbul all the way down to the Moluccas in Southeast Asia. And that is really the engine, the intellectual engine of what is happening a lot in the world of Islam. And not surprisingly, that's also where most of the interesting things are happening within one's understanding and appreciation of what's happening with Shi'i intellectual history as well. Okay, now this is the structure of what I want to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to just say a couple of things about the key concepts which I've mentioned in the title. The first one is this notion of Arab-Persian cosmopolis. And I want to actually suggest that it might be a useful alternative to two terms which are very common nowadays, one of which is Persianate and the other one is Indo-Persian. And I want to see how maybe we can think a bit more broadly about this particular way of looking at that space between Istanbul and the Moluccas. The second one is to look a bit more at what the nature of Shi'i Islam is in South Asia, some of the early centers and encounters, and within that context, look at the significance of the Deccan. I think increasingly people are aware of the importance of the Deccan. There's a recent book by Roy Fischel on the Deccan. There's also Emma Flatt's recent book on the Persian cosmopolis with respect to the Deccan as well. And so, you know, for a long time when the Deccan was very much, study of the Deccan was very neglected, you know, ever since the work of Harun Khan Sherwani, there's really not been a huge amount of work on those sorts of intellectual endeavors. And then something further about what the nature of these networks have been and how, in particular, they link up with the Shi'i shrine cities. One thinks especially of the shrine cities in Iraq, which in much of this period was actually under Ottoman control, but also looking at the shrine cities in Iran. And then I will follow that by looking at 4 particular case studies of how these networks develop, how particular individuals make these connections across the board. And 2 of the case studies are individuals in the Deccan, broadly speaking, although they were not entirely unfamiliar with what was happening further north. And 2 of the figures are more familiar with us from the context of Abad. And in fact, they come in at the point where, although I did signal before colonialism in the original title, in a sense, they straddle the colonial period. So they were active in that period, which saw the beginnings of a significant British presence and political authority in North India, and then eventually even straddled the beginnings of formal empire after 1856 and 57 in the north. So that's basically the structure of what I want to talk about. So the first point is to begin with these terms: Persianate, Indo-Persian, Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. Now, again, this sort of feature is very much this focus arises out of the development of connected histories. I mean, one can't ignore the fact that a lot of this is due to the important work of individuals like Sanjay Subramanian, who famously wrote this article of his Iranians Abroad, which goes back to, I think, 1991, 92 perhaps, his work with Muzaffar Alam. Then we've had people like Ronit Ritchie, who's written about the way in which connections and translations work across from the Arabian Peninsula into India and also into Southeast Asia. And increasingly, the sort of debates that we're having about the Persianate, which are different ways in which colleagues working on Persian studies as well as Persian in India are trying to engage with the legacy of Marshall Hodgson's work. And then, as the final point, it will be about this term Indo-Persian as well, and what does Indo-Persian bring to the debate, which perhaps the others don't do. But I'll go through Persianate and Indo-Persian first, and then I'll say something about the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. So, yeah, these are just some of the recent works which I think are important in that sort of debate. You've got Mana Kia's book. Mana, of course, was on recently. You've got Richard Eaton's book, which again will be familiar with a lot of people. Ronit Ritchie's Islam Translated, and then these 2 works which are both called The Persianate World, one being Niall Green's and the other one edited by Abbas Amanat and his former student Asif Ashraf, who's now at Cambridge. And certainly if one's interested in this whole question of what we understand by Persianate, as a frame in which to locate these Shi'i networks, then these are the sorts of works which might be useful to consider. I think one small clarification is used, and this is raised in the Amanat work in particular, is that sometimes people, and a number of others raise this, that sometimes when people talk about the concept of the Persianate, especially in India, or the Iranis, there's this assumption, which is broadly speaking ahistorical, that Irani means Shi'i. It means association with very particular spaces in Iran, and it's juxtaposed with those who may be either emphasize the Arabic or emphasize other kinds of origins, either local origins or origins in Central Asia and elsewhere. So if you do not describe yourself as being Persianate or Irani, you are somehow by definition Sunni, perhaps Central Asian, perhaps linking oneself to Yemen and so forth. And it's really not that simple. The concept of Persianate that I am more interested in, which is somewhat limited in the way it's normally used, would actually embrace Yemen and Central Asia and other places as well, and is not a straightforward sectarian distinction between whether one's Sunni and whether one is Shi'i, and the connections that one makes within the context. So first of all, the word Persianate, as we all know, the word, I suspect you will have discussed this with Mana and others, so I'm not sure I need to say very much about this, but I'm just going to say a few quick things about the term Persianate. As we know, it's first used by Marshall Hodgson in his famous The Venture of Islam, which I think still remains a very important historical study of Islamic civilization. And he's talking about this zone from the Euphrates to the Oxus, and he describes it in terms of culture and language. And so it's a useful way, as I mentioned, of breaking down and going beyond nationalist historiographies. Of course, the question is whether it overemphasizes Persia and Persian as a language itself. There's another question about whether it establishes new canons which replace other canons. So whether those canons are of Sanskrit or vernacular languages, opposed to, say, the notion of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which we'll come to in a second, and also replacing perhaps the hegemony or the significance of Arabic. But what is important, perhaps in terms of the practices, is how it is that Persianate brings to attention certain key texts which become significant across this Persianate zone, right? So one thinks about Divan-e-Hafiz. Now, Divan-e-Hafiz, it's very timely. As some of you will definitely know, it is Shab-e-Yalda. In India, it definitely is Shab-e-Yalda because it's night. It isn't quite here yet. Shab-e-Yalda, of course, is the winter solstice. The actual time is around 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And as we know, Iranian peoples of different types celebrate both the spring equinox, which is Nowruz, the 21st of March, and they also celebrate Shab-e-Yalda on the 21st of December. And for both, the Divan-e-Hafiz is very important. So if you've ever seen the table which is set for Nowruz and Shab-e-Yalda alongside the Haft scene, you have the 7 things starting with the letter Sin. You also have a copy of the Quran and usually have the Divan-e-Hafiz. And even if you do not have the Quran, you definitely have the Divan-e-Hafiz. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the way in which the Divan is then used for fal, for kind of opening up the book in random, reading a ghazal for a certain person, and that is supposed to tell them something meaningful about how their next year is going to go. Of course, as we know, most of the ghazals of Hafiz either are very similar in content or are similarly ambiguous, so it doesn't actually necessarily tell you something very useful. But the attachment to the Divan-e-Hafiz is something which is important, and it's, as I said, it's found amongst all sorts of Iranian peoples. in Iran, in Central Asia, and Afghanistan. Certainly, the Diwan-e-Hafiz remained a very important work in South Asia, arguably until very recently, and traveled into further east and southeast. Then you have the models of important works such as the Khamsa of Nizami. You had the very important ethical works of the Bustan and the Golestan of Saadi, which remained essential texts. You had, of course, the Masnavi of Maulana Molavi. And we've, in recent years, found out a lot about texts such as Yusuf or Zulaykha and the wider corpus of Jami, which, despite being written in Persian, was widely disseminated and naturalized in lots of different contexts. So we have translations of Jami into Bengali. We have images, remnants of Jami in Arakanese. We have Jami, of course, being translated into Chinese and so forth. So this new kind of canon of what I'm calling humanism, which connects the homiletic, the practical, the esoteric even, becomes an important element of the Persianate. Now, Amonat puts forward a fairly interesting idea of, how do we begin to define the Persianate in terms of actual intellectual practices. And he talks about 4 modalities, which I think are quite useful. So he talks about how in the Persianate sphere, there are particular ways of looking at statecraft, of akhlaq, the akhlaq literature in particular, the ideas around circles of justice and equilibrium, and the moral psychology of the pursuit of virtues and the foregoing of vices, and how they come together with notions of divine kingship. So sometimes what is known as the Turco-Persian model of kingship, which later becomes imbued with certain mystical, messianic, sacred notions, which, for example, Asfar Moin talks about in his book, The Messianic Sovereign, and which is associated also with the dissemination of the Shahnameh. So the Shahnameh Ferdowsi and how it is disseminated across this space. Everyone, in 1600, for example, pretty much everyone in this wider Persian zone knew that if you really wanted to give a gift to the king, the best gift you could give them is a beautiful Shahnameh, right? And this is true of the court in Istanbul, it's true of Southeast Asia, it's true of different parts of South Asia and beyond. The second point he talks about is the centrality of Sufism, of a certain antinomian path of blame, which is Persian known as malamat, and the significance of holy men in spaces. Right. So this is an important feature, you could say, of the civil society, or the what is beyond the court. Although, of course, it does intersect with the court, which is true and which is important of the Persianate context. The third element he mentions is precisely some of these texts which I've mentioned before, the centrality of texts like the Diwan-e-Hafiz, the Khamsa Nizami, and its different imitations, of course, then the Haftarang of Jami, the Bostan and Golestan of Saadi, the Masnavis of Maulana, of Attar and others, and how these texts are absolutely essential to the making of a learned, a refined, cultured individual within the sphere. And then the fourth, so this idea, I guess you would call, of adab and zarafat, which one finds across the sphere. And the fourth modality he talks about is common material to culture. So this is precisely the things about ways of dress, of comportment, of adab, the way in which buildings look, and styles develop, which can be easily seen, right? I think the main problem perhaps with the Persianate is, as I said, it maybe overemphasizes Persian as such, and one has to think about how one goes beyond Persian. So it's not just a question of finding Persian terms in other languages, but what else is going on, what other kinds of cosmopolitan arrangements are available. And I think quite significantly, it ignores and it strangely sidelines Arabic And this is odd because when you look at the learned culture in particular of the Persianate sphere, it is really difficult to conceive of intellectuals who are not as conversant and comfortable in Arabic as they are in Persian, right? So they're very much still producing works in Arabic, they're reading works in Arabic, and they are engaging in Arabic literature and linguistics and stylistics in a serious way. So, for example, again, coming back to Jami, one of the most influential works of Jami was Al-Fawaid al-Diya'iyya, which is a work on Arabic grammar that Jami wrote for his son. And this work is arguably the most prevalent Arabic grammatical text found in the Persianate zone. You know, everywhere from Istanbul through to libraries in India, libraries in Southeast Asia, libraries in China. The Fawaid al-Diya'iyya is absolutely ubiquitous. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that we don't necessarily remember this now because, again, of the way in which literary histories have been nationalized. So when people think about the literary history of Arabic, they think very much in terms of what Arabs have produced and what Arabs study now. And they don't necessarily study the Fawaid al-Diya'iyya. But for this very long period of time in this massive area, it was the Fawaid al-Diya'iyya of Jami which was being studied. Now, so as I said, I think there are different ways in which we can tweak Persianate, but maybe Persianate does not work. So let's think of another option. And so that's next slide. Oh, sorry, this is a picture which I cribbed off Richard Eaton's book, which is a nice picture which shows you his conception of the Persianate world, and it's quite interesting the way in which Arabic and Arabian is actually inserted or inscribed in this. Okay, the next slide. The Indo-Persian. Now, this is another important question about whether Indo-Persian might be a better way of looking at this, especially when we're looking at the question of what the Persian means within India or within South Asia. Now, of course, those who are familiar with literary history will be familiar with the idea of the Sabk Hindi. So as we know, Sabk Hindi is widely used to describe what Paul Lozensky has called the Mughal Safavid Ghazal and poetics in that Mughal Safavid period. And when nationalist literary histories were being written in the 19th and 20th century, they divided the history of Persian literature and styles into different sabks. And Sabk Hindi, to a large extent, was derided and really considered to be inferior, partly because it was mainly produced in India, but also, which actually, strictly speaking, is not necessarily true, but also because it stylistically seemed to be a bit clumsy. It used long meters as opposed to short meters, and the idea was that good poetry should be in short meters. So, for example, the Masnavi of Rumi and other works and Attar tend to be in shorter meters. When one thinks of the long meters of Sabk Hindi, one thinks of poets such as Mirza Bedil, Saib Tabrizi, and so forth. They also were they thought that the way in which heavy sort of metaphysical themes were dealt with in Sabk Hindi was very obscure. It was difficult. It didn't mean that poets such as Maulana and Attar and Sanai and Nizami did not engage in metaphysics or even in mystical thought, and certainly Jami. But rather that the way in which Sabk Hindi dealt with it was somewhat clumsy. And so then from that you get the sense of, well, is Sabk Hindi kind of a way of life which is complicated, right? So it's a way of looking at literature and intellectual production and transmission which is excessively complicated, is likes to multiply entities and devices and styles beyond what is necessary, so that Sabki Hindi can then be applied not just to poetry, but to all sorts of writings and intellectual productions in this time, even maybe ones which are produced in Arabic. And that's, I think, an interesting question when we start looking at some of the important Arabic works in the 18th century. One thinks, for example, of the work of Azad Bilgrami and others, and whether there is that kind of stylistic element within it. And it also raises the question of what is Indian about the Persianate? You know, how, in what sense does one find within this frame of the Indo-Persian the coming together of, you know, what is sometimes called the Persian and the Sanskrit cosmopolis? Now, of course, cosmopolis has been used by Sheldon Pollock for the Sanskrit cosmopolis to mean, you know, not just literally the space of Sanskrit production within South Asia, but also the significance of motifs and ideas and symbols from that production, which go far beyond both usages in Sanskrit, far beyond South Asia, and also into other kinds of languages. So one thinks of, for example, somewhere like Siam, as it used to be called, and certainly Thailand as it is now, very much being part of what one might describe as the Sanskrit cosmopolis, as well as pretty much most of the archipelago of Southeast Asia. You know, certain other things one can think about is what's particular about the Indian aspect of Indo-Persian is the way in which the humanities and self-fashioning and the way in which world-making is engaged, the sorts of texts that one sees, the travelogues that one sees, as well as the beginnings of the serious engagement with the language. So, you know, for example, someone like Sirajuddin Khan Arzu in the 18th century is a very important figure. There is Arthur Dudney's work on Khan Arzu. There is Prashant Keshav Murthy's work as well. Khan Arzu is a very important person, apart from the fact that you know, he was interested in the relationship between different languages. So Siraj al-Lughat is very much a work interested in the relationship between Persian and Sanskrit. But he was also very much defending the way in which Persian usage in India is quite significant and sometimes even normative against its Iranian detractors. So, you know, one's familiar with this argument within Persian between Hazine Lahiji, who of course famously left Iran after the Afghan sack of Isfahan, eventually ends up in Banaras much later, and who is, to put it bluntly, rather dismissive of Indian culture, and especially Indian usage of Persian, and the way in which Khan Arzu defends Indo-Persian and actually goes on the attack. And then one sees this debate about Persian and who, in a sense, owns Persian or who has a right to speak about Persian being played out in the Tazkira literature in the 18th and the 19th century, resulting from this. And also you have the very important works of Azad Bilgrami, who I've already mentioned, not just his kind of Arabic praise of Hindustan, Subhat al-Marjan fi Athar Hindustan, which is still a relatively understudied work. There are a number of editions of this text now. There's at least one Aligarh edition, and there are 2 editions produced in Iraq, and I'm sure there are plenty more. And these are not to include the lithographs. I've got a picture of the lithograph here, and his Ghazlan al-Hind, which is about the poets of India who were engaged in Arabic and also in Persian. So the way in which you know, those who were very much in India thought that they had as much right and authority and control over and even a certain normative understanding of the language in comparison to those who may have come from places where they claimed to be much more native speakers of the language. So there are different elements in how Indo-Persian might indicate the ways in which what is more specifically Indian about the usages of Persian, a certain literary style, which might be more particular and more useful with respect to Persian, in comparison to Persianate. But what I really want to suggest as the useful frame for these Shi'i networks is a different concept, and this is the next slide. And this is this idea of the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. Now, as I said, I'm very much drawing upon Ronit Ritchie's work, as well as some other recent-ish work on Arabic in India. So one thinks of Tahir Qutbuddin's important article, which is around 20 years ago now, I think. And recently there are two doctoral dissertations at SOAS, the Simon Leese's work. There's Christopher Ball's work. Christopher's now at Durham. Simon is at Utrecht. And they really show how it is that Arabic always works alongside Persian, that the scholarly language of the learned remained Arabic, that it was often inflected in the Persian, and that Arabic produced a certain kind of republic of letters in which Arabic grammar, Arabic inscribed disciplines remained important and were links within South Asia, but also far beyond as well. I mean, for example, you still have the very simple and obvious point where, ijazas, which are these licenses for study and of transmission of texts between scholars, continue to be written in Arabic, of course, so, and this is not just, licenses for the study of hadith or for more scriptural texts, but even, sometimes for literature, sometimes for the study of philosophy, for the occult, for theology, for mystical texts, and so forth. And especially in the 17th and 18th century, you can actually see a way in which Arabic is increasingly being reinforced within this context, and the Indians are increasingly playing an important role in inscribing Arabic. So we'll come back to the case of Sayyid Ali Khan, who's one of my key case studies, who wrote most of his corpus of works in Arabic. He wrote a very important commentary on, he wrote two important commentaries on Arabic grammatical texts. One is on a grammar written by Sheikh Bahai in the Iranian Sheikh al-Islam, or not Iranian actually, the Amili, so from Jabal Amel, modern Lebanon, jurist who ends up in Iran and becomes the Sheikh al-Islam of Isfahan, as well as the text which I've already mentioned, which is Al-Fawaid al-Diyaiya of Ajami. As well as, two very important figures of the 18th century, again, rather understudied, one being, of course, Sayyid Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami, and the second one being Sayyid Murtaza Zabidi. Murtaza Zabidi's Arabic lexicon, Taj al-Urus, is used by pretty much everyone. Most people who have engaged with his work, or for example, have read his very famous commentary on Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, probably do not realize that he was someone who came from Bilgram, who came from these Sayyids who had, claimed a descent from Wasit in Iraq and had come and settled eventually in Bilgram. I had been there for a number of centuries at that point, but still retained a sense that they were part of this wider kind of Arabic sphere. So I think for these sorts of reasons, I know it sounds a bit clumsy, Arabo-Persian cosmopolis, but it gives you a sense of which there is this wider cosmopolitan space. And by cosmopolitan, I mean deliberately the idea of connectivity, of being able to travel, having skills which you can transfer from one space to another in search of patronage, and a space which is beyond perhaps the narrow confines of where Arabic was originally studied, or Persian was originally studied and being transmitted. So it goes far beyond that. It allows for individuals training in Arabic and Persian to allow them to connect to others, and it then became part of the multilingual world in which people lived. I think this multilingualism is very important. One of the features, there are a number of kind of negative features of modernity that one can talk about, and one of them is the ways in which we are extremely nowadays monolingual. And one of the features of that is that we are increasingly monolingual in English. And certainly with respect to these sorts of debates and literary productions within the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis, English doesn't even begin to describe and render what the possibilities are there. It doesn't necessarily appreciate the ways in which the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis interacted with, for example, Marathi or Bengali or Deccani or Telugu and other languages and other literary practices which perhaps came out of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, but then interacted and became interpenetrated with the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. So that's really the frame. Now I realize that's a ridiculously long tamheed, so I should really start to get into the question of Shi'ism, because I haven't really mentioned that much. So let's move on to the question of what is Shi'i in South Asia. So the next slide. Yes, so just a few sort of general points which I want to make about Shi'i Islam and the Arab-Persian cosmopolis, and then we'll say a few things related to that on the Deccan and the shrine cities. So obviously we have this wider theme of the devotion and love for the family of the Prophet, of shrines and pilgrimage to those centers, but also their replication within South Asia, the role of descendants of the Prophet, Sayyids, as kind of mediating holy figures. We have the dissemination of the learned culture of Shi'i Islam, so not just the key Arabic texts, the original texts being disseminated within India, but also the process of vernacularization, so how some of the key works were then translated into Persian. Now, what's really interesting, again, if you just look at simple things like the manuscript traditions that we have in South Asia, in the big libraries in the north, and also the libraries in places like Madras, and especially Hyderabad, is that there are certain kinds of texts which one finds in abundance in India, which you do not even find in other places. One very simple example of a text which has survived in 8 manuscripts is what's known as the Tafsir of Imam Ja'far Sadiq. Now, this is a text for which the earliest manuscript we have is the 15th century manuscript. Of the 8 manuscripts which survive, 7 survive in India. And not only do they survive in India, but it seems as if most of them were also copied in India. So that tells you something about the interest and about the idea of preserving tradition with respect to Shi'i Islam, which was present in South Asia, which is quite significant. And, you know, this is not to kind of go into this debate about whether this famous Quranic commentary actually goes back to the time of Imam Ja'far Sadiq, so very early on in the 8th century, but rather to show that this was considered to be an important text, and also the contents are very much consistent with what one sees of classical Shi'i Quranic commentary. So if you compare it to the other famous commentaries of the 10th and the 11th century, there is a large overlap in the material. And then, of course, you have the Arabo-Persian poetry of praise and mourning, which is quite important, and their inflections in different kinds of Indian vernaculars and so forth. Now, so moving on to the two further features of Shi'i Islam in the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. So this is the next slide. We'll skip this. Next slide. Again, what I want to stress, and this is significant, is the importance of the Deccan. The Deccan is really where you have significant early encounters of Shi'i Islam and the intellectual production. Now, I haven't mentioned, of course, Multan and the Ismailis in the Punjab and Sindh, which is much, much earlier, and that will kind of take me way beyond, if one was going to do a full historical survey how this develops, it's just not possible in this short period. I'm already trying to cover far too much. But there are some studies of that, and how, in fact, what we see from that period in Multan and in southern Punjab and Sindh it still has an important role in understanding the nature of culture, of Shi'i or Shi'i-inflected culture, even well into the modern period, and the way in which, for example, the role of descendants of the prophets, of Sayyids, of shrines, of the ways in which Sufi practices, Shi'i Sufi practices, are then intersected with types of kind of antinomian practice, like amongst Qalandars, as well as connecting with different kinds of Indic devotional practices in Bhakta, in forms of yoga, also in some devotional aspects of Vaishnavism and so forth. And I'm sure this has come up in your other talks, and there will be more talks, I'm sure, which deal with this, in how it is that, particularly within a Sufi milieu, you have these very important interactions with Indic themes and ideas. And it's certainly an important element of this very significant recent work by Shankar Nair, Translating Wisdom, which does that, particularly with respect to the Mughal period. So the Deccan, the earliest kind of interactions one has is in the Bahmanid period. So this was the important, I guess, sultanate which arose out of the Tughlaqs. They had a very important relationship to Shiraz. You've got the influx of Persians coming in as part of the intellectual elite at court. You have the figures such as Fazlullah Inju. You've got the beginnings of links with the study of philosophy in places like Shiraz, the Maqulat coming in. You have the holy men, the Ni'matullahis in Bidar. At this point in the early period, the Ni'matullahi order would not necessarily have been Shi'i, but they're gradually becoming a Shi'i order. And of course, you have the patronage of rulers and giving gifts to Karbala and to Najaf, to the important shrines in Iraq. So you've got Ahmad Shah's bequests, which are 300 years before the very famous Awadh bequests that everyone knows about from the 19th century. You have the important successor states in which are Shi'i-inflected and officially Shi'i. So you've got Bijapur, which officially declares itself as a Shi'i state within 2 years of the Safavids. They have a very close relationship with the Safavid state. In the early 1500s, you have then 2 official polities in the Persianate world, or in the Arab-Persian cosmopolis, which are officially Shi'i, one being the Safavids and the second one being the other Shahis in Bijapur. And you have a number of very significant intellectuals who are mediating between the Safavid sphere and the Deccan, as well as connecting with different Deccan sultanates. So you have Sayyid Ahmad Hiravi, and you have this very important figure, Shah Tahir Deccani. Now, Shah Tahir comes from the lineage, he is of the lineage of the Ismaili Imams. He is sometimes claimed as being a rival to the Imamate. So he had very important links in the Safavid state, because what we know about the Ismaili Imams in that period from Anjudan near Mahallat is that they were like the Ni'matullahis in Bijapur. The Ismaili Imams presented themselves kind of as Sufis and were linked to the Safavid state. There's a lot of intermarriage with the Safavid elites. And Shah Tahir, of course, becomes an important intermediary between the Safavid state and the different sultanates in the Deccan, the Nizam Shahis, the Adil Shahis, and others. We have, of course, his designation as an ambassador. And of course, he's also one of the most significant early figures who is teaching what by this point is considered to be the dominant Shi'i theological texts of Arabic in the Deccan. So he's teaching the texts of Nasiruddin Tusi and Allame Hilli, and he's basically disseminating, interestingly disseminating 12 Shi'i ideas and texts, despite the fact that he himself is an Ismaili Imam or claimant to the Ismaili Imamate. Again, there's much more that could be said about Shah Tahir, but we should skip. And then you have conceptions of Shi'i universal and not skip yet. You have the Qutb Shahis and Hyderabad, which of course is perhaps the best known example. The foundation of Hyderabad, the patronage, the poetry of the Qutb Shahs themselves, and the massive translation movement. I mean, this is one of the big translation movements which is happening in this period. A lot of people know about the Perso-Indica projects, Sanskrit into Persian in the Mughal period. What people don't necessarily know about is the important role the Qutb Shahis had in translating Arabic texts into Persian, particularly for Shi'i intellectual context. And the Qutb Shahis were very important. In many cases, they were translating texts even before they were being translated in Iran. And this is true of a number of the very significant collections of hadith and so forth. And then moving on to the next slide. So we have these famous Gilanis and Astarabadis in the Deccan, of which there are many. I mean, they could have been part of the mix of my case studies. You have Hakim Ali Gilani, you have Mir Momin Astarabadi, you've got Ibn Khatun Amali, and they show the way in which Shi'i intellectuals in this period, even though they are based predominantly in the Deccan, are very much linked with these other important spaces. Jabal Amil, modern day Lebanon, Iran. Mir Momin Astarabadi comes from Astarabad. He's related, he's a nephew of Mir Fakhruddin Sammaki. Sammaki is a Shaykh al-Islam of Mashhad, very important philosopher theologian himself. He's also a kinsman of Mir Abul Qasim Fendereski and Mir Damad. Mir Damad is a very significant figure in Iran, and also his works then are disseminated into North India much later. Mir Abul Qasim Fendereski, of course, we know about his interest in the yoga tradition. So, his Muntakhab Jog Vashisht is a well-known text, and his interest generally in Indic practices, his many trips to India, his audiences with Shah Jahan, etc., which we all know about. So Mir Momin's a really important figure. Ibn Khatun Lami is also a very important figure, not just because of their translations and their dissemination of the intellectual production of Shi'ism in the period, but also because they were politically extremely significant figures at court. So Mir Momin was the Peshwa. Ibn Khatun Amali succeeded him in a sense a bit later as well. So these are very significant court figures who represent that kind of fluidity of how connections work in the Arab-Persian cosmopolis. The next slide. Yeah, I think we'll skip this. We'll come back. I mean, I've written about this, of course. Nadeem Saab has also written about Qazi Nullah Shustri. Of course, his late father wrote a very important work on Qazi Nullah Shustri. But I will skip this because that would have to be a completely different paper, and there's quite a lot to say about that. The importance of the shrine cities. Now, as I said, these connections were already there very early on. So you've got, as I said, Ahmad Shah Bahmani giving gifts to the shrine cities in Karbala and Najaf. Their significance was that there were, of course, places of pilgrimage, of patronage, of giving of gifts and endowments, but also there were places of study. So people would go and study. There would establish links. There would be correspondence going back and forth. There were devotional spaces. And, then later on, as I mentioned earlier, you had the replication of these shrines within the South Asian context. The most famous example, of course, being the replication of all of the shrines in Lucknow towards the end of the Nawabi period. And there was also, alongside the pilgrimage, there was the burial traffic. So, people would be buried in the shrine cities, in the graveyards there. There were different kinds of gifts which were being made. One of the reasons why we have some, not just artifacts, but also manuscripts, which are importantly produced in India, then ending up in places like Karbala and Mashhad, is because they were given as gifts to the shrines. So given as gifts, not stolen from India. That's a different case altogether, which we also know about more recently happening, where libraries in North India in particular have been looted and sold off in many different ways. So the link with the shrine cities was extremely important. It was this kind of, as I said, about the intellectual networks. It was about pilgrimage, it was about devotion, and it was about these exchanges of patronage and of commercial transactions as well. Now, moving on. I hope I've kind of set the scene sufficiently, right, to go to our case study. So we've said enough about what I understand by the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis, said enough about the features of Shi'i Islam and intellectual traditions within South Asia. And now looking at the 4 examples of figures who were extremely significant in this kind of exchange. So the first one I have is Sayyid Ali Khan Madani, Sayyid Ali Khan Shirazi Dashtaki, and he was a figure who was, in a sense, circulating between Shiraz, Medina, Hyderabad, Isfahan. I could also add to that Yemen, Mocha, Aden, Mocha in particular, and ports in Burhanpur at some point. He's in Burhanpur and other places as well. He comes from a very prominent Dashtaki Sayyid family of Shiraz. So their network includes people like Mir Fathullah Shirazi. Fathullah Shirazi, of course, moved to the Deccan and then later ended up in the court of Akbar. He is, credited with popularizing the study of philosophy, Islamic philosophy in the north. They had this very prominent curriculum model which came out of the Madrasa Mansuriya, which was established in Shiraz in the late 15th century. And this was a way in which the study of philosophy and the intellectual sciences was balanced with the study of scripture. And the descendants of the family were significant in Hyderabad, in Shiraz, in Medina. There are descendants of the family in Iraq, in Lebanon as well nowadays. And one of the important studies of the family is by the descendant who died in 1892, if I remember correctly, Mirza Hassan Fasai. He wrote the Farsname Nasiri, which is kind of a gazette of Fars, which is the province in which Shiraz is found. But it also has a very important study of the family and the links that the family had beyond. We also know that other figures in the family were linked to the Qutb Shahis and the Safavids. They were also linked in the mediation of establishing marriage links between the Qutb Shahis and the Safavids. So these are, significant individuals. Now, Sayyid Ali Khan himself, and as you can tell from that title, Sayyid Ali Khan, this is the title that he's given in Hyderabad, was born in Medina, and he's a very significant cosmopolitan figure. So on his mother's side, his grandfather was Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Manufi, who is a Syrian Shafi'i. He was a Syrian Shafi'i mufti of Mecca, right? And of course, his father's side are these Dashtakis who've been going back and forth from Medina, Hyderabad. These 2 generations already linked to Hyderabad and certainly Shiraz. He becomes important in the study of Arabic literature. He writes a very famous work, the Sulafat al-Asr, on poets in the period. And he's mentioned in a lot of the compendia on Arabic literature and on Arabic literary figures. His own study of Arabic literature and particularly Hadith, which comes out of Mecca and Medina, connects him to individuals, not just his grandfather, who's a Syrian Shafi, so to other teachers who are from Syria, to those who are from Yemen. So he has relations for example, through the I'll come back to that in a second. With the Zaydi imams in the north of Yemen, but also with the Alawi Aidarus scholars who are in the Hadramaut. He has teachers who are from Bahrain as well. And the other important link, which is a local one for him, is that the ruling family who controlled Mecca and Medina in his time were known as the Banu al-Hassan, so they were descendants of Hassan, the grandson of the Prophet. And because of that link, there's a sense in which a lot of Sayyid Ali Khan's network is also based on the fact that they are all descendants of the Prophet, and they recognize themselves as kinsmen, regardless of whether they are Persian speakers or Arabic speakers or others. That kinship is important, which links people from Syria to Yemen, to the Hijaz, Bahrain, to Southeast, to what is now Indonesia, the Malay world, West India, and the Deccan. Now, as a young man, he moves with his father, Sayyid Nizamuddin Ahmad, to Hyderabad, and he spends some time in Hyderabad. When you have a change in the Qutb Shahis, his father is imprisoned. He's out of favor. He finds favor for a short period in Burhanpur, and he keeps on going back and forth. He goes back to Medina and Mecca. He goes to back to Shiraz, and he studies and then teaches in Isfahan for a short period. And his students in Isfahan include the Khatun-Abadi family. So the Khatun-Abadi family of scholars are related to Majlisi, Allama Majlisi, who's arguably the most significant, politically significant scholar at the end of the 17th century in Safavid, Isfahan. And also Hazin Ilaji. So Hazin, who is the famous poet and literary figure who ends up in India, is also a student of Sayyid Ali Khan from his time in Isfahan. And he writes a number of works which then connect these networks and but also reinscribe why Arabic is important in this. So he has this very famous travelogue called Salwat al-Gharib, which is an account of growing up in Medina, his travels in India, his travels in Yemen, his connections with people in Syria, and of course in Iran. And he's not the only one. There are a number of other figures. Marco Salati, for example, has written at least 2 or 3 books on figures from the 17th century who live between the Deccan, Yemen, the Hijaz, Iran, and Syria. So yeah, some people like Sayyid Abbas al-Amali and others, and they are figures who are equally comfortable writing poetry in Arabic and Persian, and sometimes in other languages, and they connect up these figures, these points of learning across these places. So Sayyid Ali Khan is one very important figure, and for many people he remains a very significant figure because he wrote perhaps the most popular commentary on As-Sahifa Sajjadiyya, which is this collection of prayers, of supplications associated with the 4th Shi'i Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin, and it remains the most prominent commentary on that. Now the next case study, which is the next slide, is Nizamuddin Gilani. Now I will say that a lot of what I'm saying about Nizamuddin Gilani comes from this excellent recent Duke PhD by Hunter Bandy. It's a wonderful work, and I really hope that Hunter publishes it soon. It's a very serious study of Shi'ism, natural philosophy, and I guess what I'm talking about, the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis within the Deccan. So he is a figure who is important in the study of medicine and natural philosophy, and of course in the study of philosophy itself. He grew up in Gilan, which in that period, at that time, although it's part of the Safavid Empire, it's not entirely incorporated, so it's fairly kind of autonomous. He studied in Shiraz and Isfahan. He goes and studies and has pilgrimages in Iraq and the Hijaz and Mecca and Medina. He moves originally to the Mughal realms in 1630 and becomes attached to Mahabad Khan. Later in 1634, he moves to Hyderabad and he dies in Hyderabad in 1662. And when he is in Hyderabad, he becomes an important person at court. He also becomes a Qutb Shahi ambassador. And in that office, he visits the Ottoman-controlled shrine cities in Iraq. Now, there is a very interesting text, and this text is on the left, the two pictures of manuscripts. The top one is his account of his teachers and significant intellectual figures that he knew. So he mentions Mir Damad and Sheikh Bahai and Mir Fendereski and Khalifa Sultan and Sayyid Abdullah Shushtari in Isfahan, all very significant figures of that period. We've already mentioned Mir Damad, Sheikh Bahai, Mir Fendereski. Khalifa Sultan was the vizier under Shah Safi and also under Shah Abbas II. Then also he knows and meets Muhammad Masoom Dashtaki, who of course is Sayyid Ali Khan's grandfather, and Muhammad Amin Asrabadi, who is the famous Akhbari figure in Mecca. In Shiraz, he comes across Shah Taqiyuddin Nasaba, Sayyid Nizamuddin Dashtaki. This, of course, is not the father of Sayyid Ali Khan, but kind of a distant uncle of his in Shiraz. Shah Taqiyuddin Nasaba is very important because apart from the fact that he's a genealogist, and for Sayyid networks, that's an important thing, he's also the key figure in the early part of the 17th century, alongside Nizamuddin Dashtaki, is actually teaching philosophy in Shiraz. And then, of course, Hakim Ali Gilani and Sayyid Nurullah Shushtari in Agra. The other thing which he does is he writes this massive commentary on the Nahj al-Balagha, which has never been published. There are a few manuscripts which remain. It's quite a unique and very serious piece of work, which is written in Arabic and in Persian. It may have been completed in Isfahan, but what we do have is that the manuscripts which have survived were all copied in Hyderabad. So they tell you something about the local significance and dissemination. Some of the best manuscripts have now ended up in India, but there are still manuscripts in Iran, but there are still manuscripts in India. So Nizamuddin Gilani is another figure who tells us a lot about this kind of exchange within this wider world in the 17th century. So these are the two case studies from the Deccan. So let's move on to the case studies in the north. So we have someone who I've written an article on, say that Dildar Ali Nasirabadi, and then the family that he kind of scholars that he spawns, who are known as the Khandan Ijtihad. So Sayyid Dildar Ali was, a figure attached to Hassan Raza Khan, who is Asif ad-Dawla's Wazir. He was then sent to study in the shrine cities by Hassan Raza Khan, where he studies with a number of significant figures, Sayyid Mahdi Bah al-Ulum, Baqir Behbahani, Mahdi Sharastani. The reason why these figures are important is because in the second half of the 18th century, there's a real kind of intellectual struggle going on in the shrine cities between what then become known as Akhbaris and Usulis, right? So Akhbaris are those who very much insist that to reach certainty in knowledge, one has to have texts which go back to the Imams themselves. Usulis are more open to the possibility of deriving law based on probability and much more open to the use of reason to come up with new understandings of theology and the law. When he returns, he becomes then a defender of the Usuli and anti-Akhbari position. He establishes the first Friday prayers in the north in the year 1200, 1786. And then he establishes a center for learning for the Shia in Deccan, which gradually becomes what is the Madrasa Sultaniya under his son, Sayyid Muhammad Sultan al-Ulama. Now, Sayyid Ali was quite a fractious individual as well, which we can see there's different kinds of debates he has. He has debates with the Farangi Mahallis, who, those who came up with the Dars-e-Nizami curriculum, the Maqulat. So he engaged with them. He wrote this work called Imad al-Islam, which is the defense of Shi'i theology against the authorities of Farangi Mahal. He wrote an anti-Akhbari work, Asas al-Usul. He wrote anti-Sufi works. there was an important this kind of struggle of authority at the Awadh court between Chishti Sufis, people like Shah Ali Akbar Maududi, and figures such as Sayyid Ali. And this is in the Shihab al-Thaqib. He also wrote a Persian version of that text. And his own sermons, which started in 1786, were then put together as Fawaid al-Safiya for the new Friday mosque, the Asifi, which was really about how this dissemination of this new Shi'i theology in this polity could work, in this Awadhi Nawabi. And in many ways, what it shows is the attempt at introducing the practices, the rational practices of the shrine cities in Iraq into North India and really establishing. And so, in some ways, one of these, consistent struggles amongst Shi'i scholarly elites across South Asia, but especially across the north, across Hindustan, since the 19th century, has been very much between those, who consider the authority of the shrine cities to be paramount, and those who are far more interested in the way in which local practices, authority, veneration, patronage works. And sometimes this plays out as a Sufi versus anti-Sufi debate, or Sufis versus mullahs, if you want to call it that, particularly in places like the Punjab, but also in parts of UP. But it also sometimes plays it out in theological terms in what's known as the Shi'i debate. Now, I don't want to go into that, but it's really, about how one sees the role of the imam and how one accesses it, whether one needs to go through authorities in the shrine cities or whether one has a more direct access. My last case study, and I realize I've been talking for far too long. I just want to show you two examples of ways in which these connections between the Khandan Ijtihad and the shrine cities work. So this, for example, is a case of an ijaza from Sayyid Ali Tabatabai to Sayyid Ali. Sayyid Ali Tabatabai was probably the most prominent jurist in Najaf in the later part of the 18th century. And then with the next slide, this is an example of one of Sayyid Ali's most significant sons, Sayyid Hussain, known as Sayyid al-Ulama, and the correspondence that he has with Wahid Behbahani, who is the famous Usuli figure who really kind of destroys the Akhbaris in Karbala, and Sayyid Ibrahim Qazwini, who is one of the first significant people to come up with a theory of a legal theory which establishes the authority of the Usuli trend within the shrine cities. These are letters in Persian. One of the interesting things in recent years is that there is this Muassese Shi'a Shanasi in Qom, which is increasingly turning its attention to works which are being produced in India. And so they have, for example, edited the correspondence of the Khandan Ijtihad. They've edited a lot of these works. For example, Awraq al-Dhahab, which is Mufti Muhammad Abbas Shushtari's account of Sultan Ulama. They've published Ainai Haqnuma, which is a study of Sayyid Ali and others. And within those editions, they have also edited a lot of the correspondence, both in Arabic and Persian, which gives you a real sense of the connections that these figures had going into the shrine cities and also going into Iran. Now, the final case study is the Musawi Kinturis. Now, again, very famous figures. Nishapuri descends to the Prophet, who settled in Kintur in Barabanki in the 14th century. There are a number of figures who are important in the family. There's Mir Muhammad Quli, who died in 1844, who acted as a judge for the British at Meerut, and eventually becoming Sadr al-Sudur. He's related to the Shushtari al-Jazairis. So I mentioned Mufti Muhammad Abbas in Awadh just now. He also had scholarly links within the Siddhabadis. I have an example of this in the next slide. And he also wrote so this is the famous correspondence between the Mufti Muhammad Quli and Sayyid al-Ulama, the son of Dindar Ali, who I mentioned before. So if you just go back to the previous slide, that's a thank you. So, and he has a number of important sons. The one who's perhaps best known is Sayyid Hamid Hussain, who wrote this work, this very important polemic, Abaqat al-Anwar. And it was then his son, Sayyid Nasir Hussain, who established the famous Nasiriya library in Lucknow. Another son, Sayyid Siraj Hussain, acted as also as a British judge. He's one of the first individuals to embrace English learning, translate works into Persian Urdu. His own son, Sayyid Karamat Hussain, then later became a professor at Aligarh. And so this is, I guess you could say, a different kind of cosmopolitanism, which is starting to bring English learning into the mix as well. And in fact, I think it's very difficult to understand elements of Shi'i modernism, especially in North India or even in the Deccan, without the way in which English and English learning then becomes part of this Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. And then the third figure, the third son, is Sayyid Ijaz Hussain, who is very important in terms of biographies and bibliographies. So his Kashf al-Hujab al-Astar, which he wrote on the books of the Shi'i tradition, which are available in India, actually tells us quite a lot. It predates other bibliographies by quite a long time. So, nowadays most people use Ad-Dariya of Agha Bozorg Tehrani, but Kashf al-Hujab al-Astar remains a very important source for what the Shi'i tradition was, not just in India, but also across this Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. He also wrote Shudur al-A'yan fi Tarajim al-A'yan, which is on biographies, which tells us a bit more about the networks seen from India. Of course, there's many other sources which do this. I mean, I'm taking 4 cases, but if you look at texts, we have so many texts, particularly from this period, the 18th and 19th century, which actually show how the scholarship which is coming out of people based in India or Indians studying in the shrine cities is absolutely essential for the understanding of the Shi'i tradition. So, for example, later we have Muhammad Ali Kashmiri and his Nujum al-Sama, which is a very important compendium of biographies of scholars in the 19th century, which includes a number of cases of those who were in India. You have different continuations of Amal al-Amil, 17th century. You have continuations of Sayyid Ali Khan's Ad-Darajat al-Rafi'a in the 19th and 20th century, which again, place the Indian Shi'i scholarly elite within this wider kind of network of people in different places. So just to come to some concluding remarks. So if you skip, that's it. So, texts and context are important. Within this Arabo-Persian cosmopolis and the Shi'i context, the curricula, the way in which ma'qulat, the rational sciences relate to the manqulat, the 6 scriptural sciences, the processes of vernacularization of texts, the way in which political theology is understood, patronage, polities, and the sorts of sources that we have which help us understand these links, especially the correspondence works we have, and the ijazat, which tell us about the way in which individuals and texts traveled. The next slide. And so, what I want to show is that if we want to understand kind of connected Shi'i intellectual histories within this wider Arabo-Persian cosmopolis, then the place of South Asia, of others of the north, and also of the Deccan is extremely significant, and there's lots of remnants and legacies of it. You have the cosmopolitanism of what are known as the Ajam, the non-Arabs in Karbala. You've got the students in these places. You've got the endowments. This is a little picture of the Jamia Hindi or Al Masjid al Hindi in Najaf, which certainly in the most of the 20th century and the later part of the 19th century was the most significant place of study in Najaf. You have the intellectual exchange, which goes both ways. And of course, you have the history of that period, which is then kept in the libraries and in the texts which have survived in India or South Asia generally. So, one can point to things, libraries like the Nasiriya in Lucknow, but also you have the account of Sheikh Abdul Hussein Amini, Azari, Iranian scholar who studied in Najaf. So he's also quite cosmopolitan. The family would speak Turkish and Arabic at home, and still do, in fact. And he wrote this huge work, Al-Ghadid, which is a classic kind of Shi'i compendium of the importance of the declaration of Ali ibn Abi Talib as a successor of the Prophet. And he has texts where he explains that he couldn't possibly have done this without his travels to India and connections to scholarly networks in India and access to manuscripts in India. So the modern period of transnationalism has kind of forgotten some of these links which are important, but a fuller connected Shi'i intellectual history has to engage in precisely these sorts of archaeologies. Thank you. So, where's
we've momentarily lost the connection with Professor Rizvi. There are a number of questions. Maybe we can take those.
Sure.
To begin with. I think I'm going to begin with the first question. That is, can you read this on your screen? Hasnain Aziz.
Yes.
Discussion, can you tell whether Awadh state had any relationship or connection with the Safavid Iran? I think you've taken that up. And was Shia influence in Mughal Empire of Mughal Empress Nur Jahan?
Yeah, so in the first case, it's very simple. The Safavids were pretty much finished. So you do have Safavid pretenders and Safavid descendants who actually end up in Lucknow and Banaras and other places. But yeah, there wouldn't have been a relationship because the Safavid Empire came to an end in the 1720s, which is really before Awadh really gets going. On Nur Jahan, yes, I mean, again, a lot of people have talked about it. I think one of the things I didn't really want to focus on the remnants at the Mughal court. I mean, there are lots of examples of Shi'i scholarly networks who are in the Mughal court. But I think what tends to happen is people stress this kind of link between Irani and Shi'i at the Mughal court, and it's really not that simple because not every Irani in factional terms was Shi'i, and vice versa. There were very important Shi'i figures at the court who were not Iranian. They may have been from Kashmir, they may have been from other places as well. So I think just focusing on the circle around Nur Jahan is quite limited, actually.
Okay, so another question by Ali Haider. Now this is a little detailed, and I think also Empire was he's again talking about Mughal Empire, and they were united in 1857, and many others other wars. So sectarianism widened in this subcontinent. Ali Haider, you'll have to send us a detailed question. Can you just split it in two parts so that we can read this out? Thank you. And there is a question by Mikey Nuck. Since the eloquent medieval Persian prevalent in India is now known understandable in Iran, is there some work on Persian inscriptions and epitaphs and gravestones?
I assume that question is about inscriptions in India. Again, this is not an area I really work on. There are many people who work on material culture, but there are certain compendia on these sorts of documents. So, I mean, Ziauddin Desai a long time ago did stuff on Western India and under the Gujarat Sultanate. I'm sure there are works also on inscriptions in the Deccan, but this is not something I really work on, and um, this wider question about whether Persian in India was understandable to those who were not in India. This is classically something that Hazin complains about in the 18th century. And I think it can massively be overdone. I mean, nowadays, yes, it's true. So when, for example, Iranians try to edit texts written in Persian by figures in India, they often make mistakes, usually with names of places and even customs and certain, things that were found where the Persian in India becomes inflected with the use of vernacular. But then, of course, Persian in all sorts of contexts is inflected with the vernacular. Tajik gets inflected with words from Russian. Modern Persian gets inflected with words from French, etc. So that's not so unusual. But if someone is a serious scholar of a pre-modern Persian, then they'll make an effort, and there are lexicons that you can use to make sense of the language.
Okay. So the next question is Matt Koshiki, and brilliant as always regarding the Arabo-Persian cosmopolis. Fully agree. Needless to say, but to what extent do you see a distinction in registers between Arabic and Persian continuing through the 18th century, whereby Arabic was used to assert or perpetuate scholarly authority, and Persian used to persuade a wider or courtly audience, particularly poetically? That is, to what extent do you think we should speak of the democratization of knowledge in Persian but not in Arabic as definitive of, and I'm guessing this is Arabo-Persian cosmopolis?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, Matt, thanks for that. Yeah, I think that there's something to be said for that. Um, of course, what then also happens within this is that while you do have Arabic, which is used to address a wider scholarly kind of community network, at the same time, what I would say is that how do we then deal with works which mix Arabic and Persian? I mean, there are plenty of these. There are words which mix Arabic and Persian, for example, in the Safavid context. So people like Mohsen Faiz Kashani has a number of works like this. And the work I mentioned of Nizamuddin Gilani, his commentary on the Nahj al-Balagha, which of course is an Arabic text. A lot of the commentary is in Arabic, but there are sections which are in Persian, which are very significant as well. So, and there are many other examples of texts which mix languages. Because they know that the readership is comfortable in them. One other kind of slightly more remote example is the Quranic commentary of Ismail Haqi Burusavi in the 18th century, which is, of course, in Arabic, but it has large chunks in Persian, usually poetry and stories from the Masnavi and Sadi, and also has sections in Ottoman Turkish. So again, it's reflective of a certain scholarly class which is comfortable in those different languages. And sometimes you find that happening in different kinds of contexts. I mean, one text which I'm interested in at the moment, and I'm editing with a good friend, Sayyid Nizamuddin, is an early 18th century text called Al-Bawariq al-Nuriya by a guy called Abdulhamid Tabrizi, who's an Iranian who settles in North India. He writes this text in Arabic. It's on the metaphysics, Sufi metaphysics of the school of Ibn Arabi, mixed with commentaries on Shi'i hadith. But he also has a deep interest in yoga Vedanta. So he talks about concepts from Sanskrit, which he Arabizes. He also refers to concepts in Persian. It's a wonderfully interesting text. The final section of the text is about the notion of the subtle substances, the subtle centers, the lataif in the soul, which of course corresponds to the idea of the chakras. And that tells you something about the way in which Sufi practice in this Arabo-Persian cosmopolis is being inflected by yogic practices. That's another, I mean, as I said, that's a whole area which I didn't look at, but there are so many texts which are very much part of that milieu. And a number of those texts are actually part of the Shi'i element of that milieu.
Right. So we have Professor Rizvi back with us. And the next question is from Intact Kashmir. And I will leave Professor Rizvi to read that.
Wonderful presentation. Talking about patronage, I was wondering about patronage offered by Indian nobles at the Mughal court to Shi'i ulama based in Iran. For example, we have the case of Ibrahim Khan, son of, it's gone missing. Can I
Yeah,
have the?
I was just going to say that, you know, I did mention. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Again,
fine.
in the case of Ibrahim Khan, son of Mughal Subedar Ali Mardan Khan, who not only patronized Iranian ulama but also sponsored their visit and compilation of a major Shi'i polemical work, Al-Bayaz-e Ibrahimi in Kashmir. Are there any other significant examples of such instances of patronage of sectarian, that is of Shi'i nature in Mughal India?
Yes, of course. I mean, I said I didn't really focus on the Mughal context so much. There are plenty of texts. There is, of course, the patronage of Iranians coming into the court. What I would kind of push back on is the mention of sectarian brackets Shi'i. I mean, that's not the way I look at it. I'm not particularly interested in this issue. There are, of course, polemical works which are written. You know, Ihqaq al-Haq and others were written in this context, but I think it would be misleading to consider the intellectual production of these kind of connected Shi'i ulama in South Asia purely through the prism of sectarian polemics. I mean, the vast majority of what they were doing was not that at all. They were not interested in that primarily, whether that was, of course, in the Deccan or whether it was in the North. It was very much about, yes, understanding what their tradition was. It was about engaging in the ma'qulat, as I mentioned. You know, the production of polemics was one sort of work, and I've discussed it. I have a forthcoming article specifically on the polemics of Sayyidullah Shushtari, who, you know, famously was executed for being Shi'i at the court of Jahangir, or there are reasons for that, but anyway. So it's not just about the question of the polemics. There's much more going on than polemical literature.
Well, I think you must have answered the question by Mackie Knack.
Yes, I think we did that.
Yeah. And the question of Matt.
Yeah, we did that.
That has also been done. So sorry, I mean, my network just disappeared. Even my mobile network had gone. There is a question by Sabina Kazmi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Sayyid Dildar Ali was associated with the Awadhi Nawabi regime's careful attempt to devise an inherently Shi'i entity for itself in the late 18th, early 19th century. Could you tell us more about his role in this regard?
Yes, so I did mention this, and I have an article on this which I can refer you to, which came out in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. I think one of the points I would make is that when he came back from Iraq, he was very much interested in kind of trying to establish the sort of theology and law that he saw in Iraq in an Awadhi context. So, for example, this was marked by a rational embrace of legal probability and a critique of akhbaris. It was marked by an anti-Sufism, an intolerance for Sufi practices. And it was involved in a kind of polemical pushback on the foundations of the philosophical theology of Sunnis, particularly of the Farangi Mahal, which is expressed particularly in his large 5-volume work, Imad al-Islam. So, and also establishing things like the Friday prayer, which was not common at this time, insisting upon his authority and the authority of his kind of theology at the Awadh court was clear. but I'm not sure it was entirely successful. And this is something which I was indicating when I was talking about this kind of struggle that there's been since the 19th century between those who really want to defer to the authority of the shrine cities and those who consider that there should be kind of what you might call a local flavor of a Shi'i theology within an Avadi context, right? So if one looks at the actual practices, one looks at the works which were written, for example, for Wajid Ali Shah and his own works, then this is not in line with the sort of theology that Sayyid Ali was promoting, or even his son, Sayyid Muhammad Sultan al-Ulama or Sayyid Hussein, Sayyid al-Ulama. So there is a sense in which that process, set forward kind of a struggle within the sort of Shi'i scholarly elites and within culture about how you deal with these sorts of issues.
Professor Sajjad Rizvi, there's another question, I think. Can you tell me about the history of Dawoodi Bohra community and their interaction with the Mughals? How do you see it as friendly? If you can tell some positive example, give some positive examples of Bohra-Mughal cordial relations, then it would be helpful, because Emperor Aurangzeb is set to execute Bohra leader. So I want to know the relationship between Bohras and Mughals, especially positive relations.
To be honest, I have no idea. So this is not an area that I'm familiar with at all. All I know really about Dawoodi Bohras, of course, is the kind of settlement in West India from Yemen. But I'm really not familiar with relations with Aurangzeb or anyone else for that matter. Of course, we know much more about the modern period and the relationship with the Indian state or with the post-colonial states, but I'm not familiar with the example that's been mentioned.
Possibly Ali Haider, this whatever execution you're talking about, the bad relations between Aurangzeb and the Bohras of Gujarat, is much more to deal with the Mughal state and the mercantile, relationships in the Gujarat region. Possibly it was due to that, nothing more. Sajjad Saab, thanks a lot for an excellent lecture.
Going on too long.
And I am really, really very, thankful to God that my internet connection went at a time when you were answering questions and not during the time when you were actually talking about the theme. I at least I gained much from what you had to tell us today. And we have been, as history students, we have been dealing with a lot of, these aspects which you talked about, but not in the fashion as you laid them out to us before us today. However, there is one small query, may not be related to what you talked about, but at the fag end of your, talk, you did talk about the various madrasas and educational institutions which grew up in places like Lucknow. The Madrasatul Waizeen and the other such seminaries. We also have certain such seminaries in Meerut, Muzaffar Nagar region. Can you tell us something about how they were being perceived by the scholars in Iran and Iraq, by those at Qom and Najaf and Mashhad? Were they taken seriously, or what was their attitude towards those ulama who were graduating from the Indian, say for example, Lucknow madrasas?
So I think there's a distinction here between like the circles of study around the figures of the Khandan Ijtihad and the Kintoris and, for example, the Al-Jazairis, which were mainly kind of fairly informal. and then the establishment of the formal madrasas, which really starts at the end of the 19th century, right? So you have the Sultan al-Madaris, then you have the Nazimiya, you have the Madrasul Waizin, and then you have a whole set of madrasas across North India.
Right.
Lahore has madrasas, etc. Now, by that point, things have changed quite dramatically. So the colonial period has had enough of an impact to ensure that you don't necessarily have the best people going to those institutions. The shrine cities themselves, you could argue, at the turn of the 20th century, do not necessarily have a very strong educational context either. So it's easier to make judgments about the post-colonial context, right, in which most of these madrasas across Hindustan, which of course includes Lahore and other places, are not considered to be very serious in comparison to places like Najaf and Qom. However, what is happening at around 1800, and what one sees in the correspondence that we have in that period between people in Awadh, and even in earlier period, people in Hyderabad, and going back to the major centers of learning in Iran and Iraq, is that there is a much greater kind of mutual influence and mutual respect. That is much clearer. I think that level of kind of interest has disappeared. So, people would not be terribly interested in knowing what is being written in Lucknow today, if you're sitting in Najaf. But about 150 years ago, that was not the case. And in some cases, even in the early part of the 20th century, there were still some figures who, because they were going back and forth, were important. So you think of people like Sayyid Ahmed Hindi, who is still a very significant figure between Lucknow and Najaf, and the young Sayyid Ali Naqvi Naqan Sahab, who is an important figure between the two. But it's very rare to find many other examples who go beyond that. And certainly in the post-colonial states, things have been very, very different. So the level of scholarship is just not the same. And since people have, I think, increasingly started going to the shrine cities at a much younger age, there isn't much evidence of them having studied in North India before they went, or Hyderabad for that matter. And also with respect to Hyderabad, I think there is a general kind of decline, or it sets in already after the end of the sultanates there. So there is, of course, some patronage under the Nizams, but it's not anything like what's going on up in the north.
Well, thank you once again, Sajjad. Beautiful lecture. And before I hand over to Shagufta, a small request to Sajjad Rizvi Saab, and that is that at some future moment of time, we would request him to join us once again, and this time talk about Qazi Nurullah Shustari. That is a topic which I had offered you,
Yes.
but because by that time you were quite bored by this topic, you have written about it, you have spoken about it. But as far as we Indian historians are concerned, Qazi Nurullah is still a very burning issue with us,
Absolutely.
especially after that new source discovered from the period of Jahangir, with Jahangir's own comments, he himself denying the fact that he did not execute Qazi Nurullah because of any religious causes. So after that, I think a revisit to this issue of Qazi Nurullah Shustari is very much needed. And so I would request you, Sajjad, to heed our request,
Right.
and say sometime after April.
Sure. I need to actually go back and look at that further. I'm actually more interested now in his theology.
Yes.
There is actually a wonderful PhD being done on him right now at Harvard by Shahwa Shaban. So he will, I think, have something more interesting to say on that aspect. But I do need to also look at the. I'm not convinced by the Majalis being a big change. But anyway,
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
It doesn't tell us anything new, really, to be honest. Yeah, sure. We could definitely go back to Sayyid Nullah.
Yeah. And thank you very much, Shagufta. Please, the
Thank
future
you.
programs and yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk, Sajjad sir. And what a better time than the birth anniversary week of one of the Persian, Sanskrit, and Braj scholars and influential Shia noblemen of India. And I'm talking about Abdul Rahim Khanikana. And so, someone we all grew up reading in school, and of course, we respect him. And this is the time when we have a Asha Ganga Jamani talk coming up in January on Abdul Rahim, focusing on Abdul Rahim. For Ganga Jamni, Asha, and particularly myself, it is a subject closer to my heart. That what I would have imagined at the start of the discussion. Now, there's so many threads from our earlier talks that crossed and connected today. It was only yesterday that one of our guests, Professor Tahir Kamran from Pakistan, had marveled at how Persian is still alive in India. While it does surprise, nothing gives us more pleasure than to learn that ideas and manuscripts have somehow survived and thrived, something that you brought out so beautifully in your section of the Deccan. Thank you also for shedding light on intellectuals like Nizamuddin Gilani and Sheikh Bahai. Not long ago, we had on the page of Ganga Jamni initiated a discussion on an illustrated copy of Sheikh Bahal Naan ul Halwa, originating in the Indian Dakhan. There is another connection here today. Mullah Sadra was also one of the murids of Sheikh Bahai, and is incidentally the handle of Professor Rizvi on Twitter. And so I've informed everyone here if you want to follow him. He is known as Mullah Sadra on Twitter. And I also want to say that we started earlier this year with the focus on Shi'i practices in the Qasbas. And Professor Rizvi here obliged us with a wonderful illustrated talk, and we don't get to hear more of that kind of research so often. So I want to thank Professor Rizvi for that, and this is such a beautiful connection, and the thread just goes on. For the next week's programs, Friday 25th, that's Christmas, at 7 p.m. There's going to be the popular historian Rana Safi, who will speak on a shared festival in the Mughal capital city. This is not Christmas. Um, Saturday, uh, Saturday 26th at 7 p.m., we have a food historian, Salma Hussain, who will be in conversation with Sohail Hashmi Sahib about the Padshah's table, Mughal Dastarkhan. And this will be followed by a walk with a Mughal themed, food on the 27th. Then we have on Sunday, the 27th, Dr. Catherine Schofield, who will be talking about Mughals, music, and film. So you can be sure that there'll be Mughal-e-Azam in that as well. So just want to thank you all again, and words of praise, and lots of words of praise coming in for Professor Rizvi, and want to thank you and close this evening by thanking you again, both of you, for having hosted this absolutely beautiful session, which connected so many threads. And as I said, that these are topics that are rarely discussed. And thank you for that great scholarship, sir. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all for joining us, and we want to thank you for being our wonderful, constant, consistent audience, and hope to see you next weekend. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks. Bye now.